Welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, our latest forecasts show that there are, some better times to come in the economy, that economic recovery still coming through. It has been, of course, taking longer to first emerge, but certainly with a bit more support and stimulus from the Reserve Bank, there does seem to be a little bit more of a jolt into the economic system that will help activity pick up over the next year or two.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen obviously the interest rate cuts by the Reserve Bank coming through recently and looking for the OCR to head down to 225 by the end of this year. So that additional support and stimulus that you mentioned, we do see that feeding through into more momentum in the economy through 2026. Coming on top, of course, of the previous interest rate cuts where the OCRs come down from up over 5% down to 3%. And the effects of those are still filtering through as we speak. We haven't had the labour market starting to turn around yet, although the last 2 to 3 months of data in terms of job ads and job numbers as well, just looking ever so slightly more positive. So there's just a little bit of sign coming through there. And of course, you overlay all of that with the strength in export prices that we've seen and some pretty good export performance flowing through and stimulating more economic activity in the provinces too. So you take all of that together, we think that while that upturn has been a bit longer in its gestation, longer to come through than we would have hoped, and 2025 has been disappointing in terms of economic growth, we look at the numbers out through into early 2027. We think the economy by then will be growing by about 2.3% per annum. And with some pretty slow population growth, when you look at things on a per capita basis, that's actually a pretty solid performance. So I guess all in all, when you take all of that together, it's a more positive outlook. If anything, we're starting to see the upsides to that growth through 26 and into 2027, the risks to that growth on the upside rather than sort of some of those downside risks that we'd previously been seeing where that recovery has taken longer to come through. Now, some of those upside risks do come through from the additional interest rate stimulus that the Reserve Bank is putting through. Some of them also coming through, we see in terms of government infrastructure spending activity, where there is a concerted push from government to get delivery underway by the end of this year. And so we're still a little bit on the conservative side in terms of our forecasts of where we see that going through 2026, but prepared potentially to be surprised on the upside. So you put those together and it could well be that rather than sort of 2 to 2.3% growth by early 2027, there could be more momentum coming through in those numbers. So good news at first glance when you take that all of that together.
There is still, I guess, a bit of trepidation with those larger interest rate cuts that we've been seeing from the Reserve Bank and the risk that they might well be overdoing it. Or even if they're not, that this sort of jumpstart to the economy, this sort of deliberate injection into the economy, at some point has to be withdrawn to get us sort of more back to neutral rather than keeping things stimulatory, risking inflation starting to get going with the economy at some point running too hot. So there is a little bit still of adjustment, I guess, over the next couple of years. But you've highlighted that, there is more consumer spending starting to come through in the economy. That'll be helped by the more recent interest rates eventually, but even just in the short term, there's more of the previous interest rate cuts that'll be coming through. That primary sector's in a better position. Yes, there's been a bit of a pullback in some of those commodity prices recently, so we're a little bit, again, cautious on all of that, and I think rightly so. I guess the question here is that, the one part of the economy that definitely isn't firing to the same degree is the housing market, and doesn't look like it's going to necessarily get all that much hotter anytime soon, which is, I guess, a bit unusual for the economy, given that you're not seeing the housing market jump up at quite the same pace. We've talked about survive till 25 and how the recovery was going to get going earlier. How much risk is there that, again, things don't fire quite as quickly as we might expect, and in a sense, I think, all hope?
Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum with that housing market because when we look at housing affordability stats, particularly house prices relative to incomes, housing is still unaffordable, more unaffordable than it has been at any time prior to 2020. So while those prices are not as high as they were in 2021, it is still difficult for first home buyers looking to get into the market. It is still pretty difficult from an investor point of view to justify pumping more money in there, particularly when rents are coming under downward pressure as well. I guess rather than the housing market sort of not joining the party. I think, if anything, I'd see the risks around it as we cut those interest rates and see mortgage rates heading down below 4.5, potentially down close to 4% over coming months. That the risk is the housing market actually starts to come to life a bit more than would really be desirable given those affordability equations. And that would be, I guess, from an economist's point of view, disappointing because we look at the way the economy has gone over the last 35 years. So much of it has been tied to how the housing market has gone, and yet that hasn't really created a lot of extra wealth, genuine wealth through the economy, and certainly has been almost counter to the sort of productivity improvements and increases that would drive more sustainable growth. So, if anything, I'm not too worried about where consumer spending goes to from here. My worry is that it kind of starts to drag those interest rate cuts, kind of start to drag the housing market up with it, and we start to get some more imbalances coming through there, which ultimately feed through into those questions about where interest rates might go to in 2027. You've talked about them needing to go back to neutral, and that is our central forecast at the moment, back to 3% in the first half of 2027 for the OCR. But if you're getting those imbalances coming through, if you getting faster growth, faster inflation as well, an OCR of 4% by the end of 2027 doesn't look to be out of the question. And again, in that sort of situation, you are at a stage where you are, I guess, restraining the economy and, sort of exacerbating the economic cycle once again. And I feel like we've had a bit too much of that over the last 4 or 5 years.
Absolutely. And I mean, amongst all of that backdrop as well, you've got uncertainty that still seems to be there at different levels and at different times and different ways across, the globe, whether it's tariffs or anything else. There's still sort of ongoing concern around all the different impacts that are coming through and striking. There's conflicts, there's AI, like there is a lot going on at the moment. But as you say, some of the fundamentals starting to show a bit more of a turnaround, a little bit of nervousness that, again, we sort of amplify the cycle, the ups and the downs a little bit, but also being driven this time by very different elements of the economy. And I, for one, am hoping that the housing market doesn't have to be and doesn't become a key part of that growth story. I think it's actually better for the economy, short and long term, that we have a more sustainable level of growth that comes through rather than sort of speculation as we've had it in the past. We'll assess all of that, the more recent inflation data that will come out that will help dictate some of this, what the Reserve Bank does with interest rates, and how the actual economy does recover over time on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.